For our tutorial this week, we're looking at the Roaring Twenties and the Depression. So the interwar period, the period between World War One and World War Two. It's one of the most disruptive periods in history. In Europe, dictatorships arose for the first time since ancient times. Democracy by the end of the 1920s was in crisis and into the 1930s. And due to that, people started to look for extreme alternatives to solve their problems. Whenever people face economic hardship, that's when the extreme political parties and extreme social movements start to increase in popularity because people want to find a solution. They want to get out of their problem. Um, so in the 1920s, the world went from enjoying a period of unmatched prosperity, and by the time you hit the 1930s, they're facing one of the greatest crises in the modern world. Um, so for this lecture, I'm just gonna look at three areas. So the United States in the 1920s, as an example, um, 1920s in Germany, so the contrast between the two, and then we'll look at the Depression. The interwar period, so the period between World War One and World War Two, is the most written about and studied period in history. It's that and the first century AD, and obviously the first century is popular not just because of what's happening in Rome, but obviously the rise of Christianity and Jesus. So there's a lot of books about that. There's the other period that's the most studied, this period here, so the period between World War One and World War Two. So um, I'm not going to go into a lot of the deep politics of what's happening in Europe and that because that's covered in other lectures, and it's impossible to get through the whole thing. But firstly, in the United States, so what's it like in the United States? The 1920s is where the United States essentially emerges into the 20th century and becomes a world leader. So it leads the world in cultural and technological advances. It's a period of great social change, and some of those changes um, were quite significant, and they're all the background to all of this is it is the aftermath of World War One. So the world before World War One and the world that emerges after World War Two. That period, sure, I think sees the greatest change in the whole of human history. What the values and um, just the social interactions, the economic outlook, all those sorts of things, political power, all of that, um, what it looked like before World War One is completely different in most areas after World War Two. So by the late 1940s, and so World War One is crucial to understand because World War One had been so horrific for people who were involved in those countries that were involved that it shook the foundations of the old world order. So the world of the gentry, the world of lords and ladies, in social institutions, social values, they were all exposed as just being inadequate in dealing with this new modern world. And what people thought were just almost divine right was seen to be nothing more than um, inadequate, pathetic institutions or beliefs. And so World War One shakes the world, and then as it shakes the world and shakes people's beliefs, a new set of beliefs, a new set of norms uh, appear. And so, first um, group that we'll look at is how it changes the world for women in the 1920s. Um, Life drastically changed for women in the 1920s. We look back in the way that what they wore and uh, things that they were doing. I think it's quite restrictive, but for women in the 1920s, it was a great. Well, for some of them, it was a great period of radical change. It that gives rise to the flapper. Flapper is a young girl who was daring in the way that they talked. They usually expressed their own opinions. Their behaviour, they could be flirtatious, and their dress sense. So you see image in the middle here, the flapper girl. Think about the women that you see in The Great Gatsby, those kinds of novels. That's kind of a flapper woman, and it was a reaction to the Victorian norm, so the Victorian era out of Britain. A respectable woman, um, didn't give her opinion, supported her husband, all that, dressed modestly. All of those values go out the door. So women in the 1930s would wear makeup. They would go out in public, wear short skirts, and they would even smoke in public, which was a radical thing back then. There's also political movements. This is partly due to um, the the increase during World War One of women needing to work in factories and in the workforce. 1920s, they don't just want to go back to being housewives. They want to continue with these jobs, and because they're in these jobs, there's a larger number in the workforce. They will also want political rights, so not just the joint trade unions, but also the right to vote. Um, and so they are, in many countries, they're given the right to vote. So now they've got this political influence. Also, there's an increasing number of women during this time period who are moving out of home. So they're moving away from their parents. Parents making decisions in their life, and they're they're living either by themselves or with other women, um, and not living at home till they get married and then living under their husband's rule. Um, Another significant development during this time has to do with society's approach to sex. This is going to be an obvious consequence of just the flapper movement and um, the whole idea that went with that movement. Um, in surveys after World War One, in the US, it said that there was 14% of women who were born before 1900 had engaged in premarital sex by the age of 25, while as many as 39% of women who became of age in the 1910s had sex before marriage. So the older generation, you know, weren't having sex before marriage, but as this younger generation comes through, there's an increase, 14% sex before marriage. Birth control becomes popular. So Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood, she starts to bring in birth control now. Uh, I've already talked about Margaret Sanger with the eugenics program, so she's bringing in birth control. Her primary aim is to control who breeds with who, but the kind of a flow-on effect of that, or the way you make it popular in society is you're empowering women because they can sleep with whoever they want with these new birth controls. As would not be a surprise, the divorce rate increases significantly by the end of the 1920s to 1 in 7 divorce marriages end up in divorce, which is a significant increase. So life for women significantly changes during this period. Another thing that changes is kind of working conditions and the amount of money people are making. The people working in factories and shops before the 1920s, they would work, 55, 56 hours a week. By the time you get to the end of the 1920s, they're working 44 hours. But at the same time, their wage is actually increasing by 25%. In other words, they are working less but getting paid more. Now, when you work less, get paid more, you've got more leisure time. Now, this sounds pretty obvious, but um, when you've got all this money and all this time, you're going to look for stuff to do. So, America, the US in the 1920s becomes a society that is looking for pleasure on the whole. And so things like dance halls, movie theaters, um, baseball stadiums, all of them get built and they'll become really popular during this time. Also, to go with this, um, items now became a lot cheaper. So because of increased industrialization, items now become cheaper to buy. And so, by 1929, American families spent over 20% of their household earnings on just everyday um, things like furniture, like factory-made furniture, not handmade radios, electric appliances, cars, other forms of entertainment. And so you see this a lot in history in any society where there's an increase in money and an increase or a decrease in the amount you need to work that leads people to figure out what am I going to do with this money and this time. And so they become addicted essentially to good times. Now, what they do is if they couldn't afford these appliances, they couldn't afford these activities, a lot of the time they borrowed from banks. And so that's going to be significant for when the actual depression starts. Technologically, America leads the way with many new inventions. Things like vacuum cleaners become are invented and become really popular during this time. But particularly transport, cars become popular. Henry Ford sets up an assembly line so that he can assemble cars 4 times quicker. That means that they're also cheaper. He gives his employees, a 5-day work week, and make sure they've got enough money to buy a car. And so, because you've got more cars being made, bought, you need better roads, and so that's going to stimulate uh, the infrastructure sector, making sure that there's enough roads. Also, flying becomes, planes technologically. Anytime there's wars, particularly massive wars like World War I, one of the consequences of that is that there are great advances in technology, and the plane is one of those during World War I. And so people start to fly. There's great stories of adventurers who fly from America to Australia for the first time, or things like that. And so, like Charles Kingsford Smith, the Australian Sydney Airport's named after. And so people like him become household names. There's an age of adventure, like this idea that we could almost do anything we want. Now we can conquer the air, and so it's a great age of optimism. And where before, with the working and income, all of a sudden you can own more stuff. Now, with the technological advances, things like distance don't seem to be a problem. So, a massive country like America or Australia, you get planes and cars. All of a sudden, you can live further away from your work, but still get there and still work there in time. So, suburbs start to really become popular during this time as well, thanks to these technological advances. Some other technology include things like films. So, films by the mid 1920s, um, American theaters are selling 50 million tickets each week, not each week. Um, and so films become really popular. And obviously, then film stars become and so it's this age of um, how are we going to fill in our time? Let's start to look to these celebrities. What films are they in? Radio is another really significant technological change because radio actually brings people um, together in the sense that you can disseminate information really quickly and really far through radio. Not many people know, not everyone can go to the theatre, um, and wireless and obviously uh, mail is going to take time, but radio can be more instant, and so um, it helps with things like advertising. So Wheaties, like Wheat Bix, it's the first ever ad on the radio. Sports games we can't go onto radio. You also have uh, plays being done over radio. So once again, it's kind of promoting celebrity. And so sportsmen now become really famous. And so by 1926, you have 5 million homes that have a radio. Um, and that can be compared in just 6 years earlier in 1920, there was only 2,000 radios, families or households with radios. So it's kind of exploded exponentially there. Um, Another thing that's interesting with the United States, they're bringing prohibition. So prohibition's trying to get people not to drink. And so groups like there's a group called the Women's Christians Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. Um, they bring in this prohibition, which kind of is trying to deal with a perceived heavy drinking culture in the United States. And so, because you've got this drinking problem, let's bring in laws to stop people from drinking. Now, you don't need to be a genius to realize this is just going to promote underground drinking culture and partying culture. Now, not only where before, if you drunk too much, you could be seen as, town drunk. That's a blight on your character. Now, drinking is a rebellious act, and so you could be seen as someone cool. Someone's going up against the establishment. So it's no surprise that these prohibition laws actually increase crime and actually increase, um, yeah, even these crimes like Al Capone becomes a gang mobster leader and becomes famous. So once again, has the intended effect is to stop this drinking culture, but all it does is actually just promote um, drinking as becoming a cool thing to do. I'm going to use some teenage language there. Last thing in the United States we'll look at is whenever you have a society that has been pushed with new extreme ideas and significant changes, society seems to be changing a lot. All of a sudden, women are smoking in your face, giving their opinion. You have people drinking, people sleeping around. Um, some people in society will find that disconcerting, and so they may look to more extreme groups who promise to defend traditional values. So the KKK, for example, re-emerges during this time period. So it re-emerges during World War One, but in the early to mid 20s, it becomes really popular because the KKK stood up for the white Protestant Gentile, as they would say, who has been left behind by this new society. Because not everyone got rich, not everyone got better wages, not everyone got access to the same amount of stuff. In big cities like New York and that in those kinds of cities, yes, a lot of them did. But you're living in Alabama, you're living in Selma, wherever you're living, you may not have that kind of access. And so, who's defending you? Who's defending your right? Who's making sure you still have a place in society? Who's defending traditional American values, as they would say? And that's why the KKK and segregation become really a significant issue during this time. So the KKK kind of re-emerges, becomes really popular once again. One observer during this time period said that the Ku Klux movement seemed to be another expression of the general unrest and dissatisfaction with both local and national conditions, the high cost of living, social injustice, inequality, poor administration and justice, political corruption, um, conflicting thoughts, all that sort of stuff, which are distressing all thoughtful men. In other words, all these changes are happening and there's a significant unrest and dissatisfaction. And so people now, when I say they are popular again, it's not just that people joined the KKK. A lot of people would support what the KKK stood for, but not necessarily their methods, and may not necessarily join, but they could see that they had a point. The KKK never really promote themselves as, we're going to be this group that's going to be violently racist, and people in history are going to hate us and our movement in years to come. They don't promote themselves like that. They always promote themselves as sticking up for um, the man on the street who's the government's forgotten about, who this new society's forgotten about, and we hear you, we see you, and we want to defend your rights. That's a very different message to, hey, come burn crosses at the front of the local African American pastor's house. So that's how they would promote themselves during the time. So that's what's happening in America in the 1920s. In Germany, the reason why I want to focus on Germany, and we'll see in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be looking at the rise of Nazism. And the 1920s kind of skip over most of what happens in the 1920s. So we want to look at what happens there. And once again, we need to start at the end of World War One. And so by November of 1918, Germany is in a state of collapse and revolution. The generals of the German army have lost control of the armed forces, and many fear that there's going to be a Russian Revolution type of communist revolution in Germany. And so, and just like in Russia, where there was a civil war happening between the Bolsheviks and the Whites, they feared that that would happen in Germany. So that's the great fear at the end of World War One, that there's going to be a civil war and that the communists are going to try to take over. So yeah, Kaiser Wilhelm II, he abdicates on the 9th of November, and so they have elections in December of that year, and a new parliamentary constitution. Now that is that new assembly met and formed met in a town called Weimar, and so it formed the Weimar coalition, or they create the Weimar Republic. So the period from 1918 through to 1933, with when the Nazis get in, that's the Weimar Republic period. Now, the Weimar Republic immediately faces revolution. The Spartacists are one group. The Spartacists are named after Spartacus, the Roman slave who fought against the Romans 73 BC. And so they kind of view him as like, this guy stood up for workers' rights, which he didn't. He didn't stand for, like, he wouldn't be a communist. But people don't need to know, people don't worry about that stuff, the true side of history when you're trying to create a political movement. So the Spartacists are led by Karl Liedeneck and Rosa Luxemburg, and they want to overthrow the Herbert. So Friedrich Herbert is the president of the Weimar Republic. They want to overthrow him. They want to set up a council of workers, just like in Russia. And so these guys, they fight on the streets. The government is supported. The Weimar Republic is supported by the Freikorps, or which are ex-soldiers who have returned from the war, from the front lines, and they're fighting for the government. And there's kind of days of this bitter street fight in Germany, and eventually the Spartacus fail. They get arrested, they get killed or executed. But there was a genuine fear that communists might take over. Now, Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler is in Munich at this time, and so he's seen this firsthand because he still technically works for the army at this stage, and so he sees what the communists are doing, and so he never forgets the threat of this communist takeover. Because even though the Spartacus revolution doesn't work, the communists are still a political party in Germany. The So after that crushes, they bring in this the Weimar Republic Constitution, which kind of sets out all the freedoms that this new Weimar Republic has. Yet it has two fatal flaws in it. Firstly, and both of these fatal flaws, as we say, actually undermine democracy. And so here is a constitution that's meant to uphold democracy, but it has these two aspects to it that actually will undermine democracy. The first one is what's called Article 48. Now, Article 48 is in times of emergency or perceived emergency, the president can call for emergency powers, and so he can override any aspect of the new constitution and use the military to keep order. In other words, whenever the president wanted, and usually the chancellor support him or get him to do this, he could rule as a dictator. So anytime the president wanted to, for some reason laws aren't getting through, the president could essentially say, you know what, we're going to get rid of the parliament. I'm going to bring in these new laws, and if you don't do them, I've got the military to support you, and that's in their constitution. So that's kind of and they do that several times during the Weimar Republic period, and it just shows how democracy doesn't isn't working in Germany, and people in Germany grow to resent it. Second thing about constitution that undermines democracy is they have proportional representation, which meant if your party receives, for example, 15% of the vote, you receive 15% of the number of members of parliament. Now, this meant that parliament had many different parties in it, and none of them had any interest, or there was nothing to force them to have any interest on trying to work collaboratively together in order to get laws through. So there's nothing to drive people or motivate people to actually work together. So if I could use my 15% representation in parliament to undermine the current government, I could do that, and there was nothing stopping me. So in the 14 years or 15 years between during the Weimar Republic period, so 1918 to the start of 1933, there were 21 different governments. Now, I think it was about 2010. There was a period in Australian politics where we had Rudd, then we had um, Julia Gillard, and Rudd came back, and then we had some Liberal prime ministers named Abbott and all that sort of stuff. So we went through a period where we had multiple different prime ministers, and I remember at the time there were countries around the world who were kind of mocking Australia, constantly changing leader. You take that period, which lasted a few years, but in in Germany, it went from essentially 14 years. You had 21 different style of government, so people really got over trying to support this thing called democracy. Um, Another significant thing that happens during the 1920s is the cap push. Push is the German word for a coup d'etat. There is no English word for that. So a push and a coup are the same thing. One's French, one's German. So Kapp is Wolfgang Kapp. He wanted to. He's part of the army, and because of the conditions due to the Treaty of Versailles, the army wanted to get rid of the current government because it was just like the Treaty of Versailles is humiliating for the German army, and you guys supported it. You guys signed it. They didn't actually support it, but that's how they make it look. And so he's trying to. So Wolfgang Kapp and people with him want to overthrow the government and reinstate the German monarchy. But this, it only lasts 4 days. It fails. Once again, the Free Corps intervene and help out, but it does lead to an increasing amount of political assassinations. Between 1919 and 1922, there are 376 political assassinations. And so that's pretty much one every 3 days, someone is getting assassinated by, mostly right wing organizations. Um, then you get inflation in the 1923 particularly. Um, Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies, so pay back because they started World War One, or they were accused of starting World War One. And so by 1923, inflation is just so ridiculous they can't actually cope with it. They're meant to give the French army, the French, I think it's 20,000 light poles, and so they couldn't pay it back. Um, what one way that the government decided to deal with inflation was to print more banknotes. Now, often I have students go, "Why don't they just print more notes? Wouldn't that just help everyone that's poor?" Well, that just leads to increased inflation. So you have stories of workers who would get paid twice a day. So you'd go to work in the morning, you get paid, and you would have someone from your family there, hopefully, who would go out and buy lunch. Um, then they'd come back and you get paid again uh, after lunch, and your child, whoever you brought with you, they would go buy dinner and breakfast. The reason why is if you waited till the end of the day to try pay for your dinner, inflation had gone up so much you wouldn't be able to afford it. There's a famous story. This story comes that two women, primary source, two women were carrying a laundry basket filled with banknotes, and there's a crowd around a shop window. They put the basket down for a moment to see if they could buy anything. They turned around. The money was left untouched, but the basket was stolen. In other words, you have a basket full of banknotes, and the basket is worth more than all the banknotes that are in there. You see the picture on the right here, the boys, they're playing with wads of cash. So that's how much, how little money meant, that money meant. So that money means absolutely nothing to this family. So they've given it to their kids to play games with. And so by November of 1923, $1 American was worth more than 44 billion Reichsmarks. And so Germany had gone bankrupt because they couldn't pay back, like France and um, their reparations. France decided to actually occupy the Ruhr area, which is the industrial area. And so this is a humiliation for the Weimar Republic because the French, who hate Germany, um, they've come in and they essentially just occupying as an occupied force, just parts of Germany, and are saying we're not leaving until you pay us. Now the German government told the workers to go on strike, make life as difficult as possible for the French, all that sort of stuff. But it was still an embarrassment for for the Weimar Republic and the German government because you've got your most hated enemy who are just treating your country like they run the place. However, they come up with a new plan, the Dawes Plan, uh, and so that's leads them out of economic hyperinflation, and they start to actually um, things start to prosper in Germany from 1924 to 1929. Within 2 years, so by the time we hit 1925, Germany's economy is booming. It's only second to the US, so it's the most growing economy in Europe at the time. The reason for this is that the German economy was injected with uh, $25 billion worth of foreign money. Most of that, or more than half of that, is coming from the US. Now, that's going to be significant, obviously, when the depression hits, because those US loaners, the banks and all that stuff, they want that money back once the depression hits. And so not only did Germany lose their source of income, they've actually got to pay back things. So the depression hits them even worse. But we'll talk about that more with the rise of the Nazis. Francis Carsten, who's an historian, he writes that the years 1925 to 28 were the heyday of the Weimar Republic. Prosperity was restored and parliamentary institutions seemed to be accepted by the majority of the electorate. Indeed, no observer of the political scene in 1928 would have prophesied that 5 years later Hitler would be in power and parliamentary democracy in ruin. And so, even though on the outside, by the time you hit October of 1929, on the outside, in the US, in Germany, in Europe, even in Australia, things look great. It's one tragedy away from things really collapsing, which is obviously what happens with the Great Depression. So 24th of October 1929, Wall Street crashes. So 16 million shares of stock are sold. Within a month, 40% stock values have fallen by 40%. There's a bunch of reasons for um, the Wall Street crash. There's a lot of economic and financial reasons. I'm particularly skilled in that, so I'm not even going to try explain all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to quickly go through the impact that it has on the US and then the impact that it has on Australia as well. Um, and so all countries around the world get significantly impacted, like Germany, for example, but we'll look at that with the rise of the Nazis. Japan especially gets hit hard with the depression because people aren't buying things like silk anymore because it's a luxury item, and so they get really hammered by it, and so that's when the military in Japan decide we need to do something about it. So they expand into Manchuria and they start to control the government. So they become a military dictatorship in the 1930s. Um, And so it's the depression that kind of drives the US to dictatorship, and other not the US, the Germans to dictatorship under Hitler, and Japanese dictatorship under um, the military, and then you got Mussolini, all that sort of stuff. So it's the depression is really hitting these societies hard. Some impacts. It's obviously going to lead to great poverty and homelessness. So unemployment rate in the US increases significantly. It's up to around about 25%. Many families lost their homes, and they're forced to live in these makeshift shelters. They call them uh, Hooverville villas. So they're kind of just shanty towns named after President Hoover. Soup kitchens, bread lines have become common, and one of the things that you see is people, particularly men at the time, their job was their way of providing for their family, and so their job was significant for them, and that idea of providing for the family. Then all of a sudden they couldn't do that, and all of a sudden, because homelessness becomes a big thing, you live in these shanties. You've gone from comfortable middle class living to all of a sudden living in a shack, and not just you and your kids, but often your maybe your brother and his family might move in, or your parents might move in. And so you've got multiple generations living in these towns and these shanty towns and these houses that a year or two ago you would drive past and be disgusted by, that all of a sudden you're living there. And so it's that kind of impact on people that drives them to more extreme solutions. Now, it doesn't happen so much in the US, but particularly throughout Europe. That's why part of the reason why you get these more extreme governments. There's an agricultural crisis that's happening in the US during this time. Crop prices obviously they fall. There's droughts in the south, which lead to these great dust storms because it's so dry down there. Um, and farmers lose their land, lose their livelihoods. And so what the President Roosevelt does when he becomes president, brings in this thing called the New Deal. The New Deal is how he's going to actually deal with it, obviously. It's similar to, if you want to use an analogy, but is kind of not unlike Joseph's plan, Genesis, Joseph's plan when famine hits Egypt. You say we collect the grain, and we're going to save some for the 7 years of famine. And so, what the New Deal had, part of it was public housing was subsidised. So um, you could, uh, the government would pay for part of your accommodation. Stock exchanges were regulated. Short-term jobs were created, um, and there was a deficit spending policy which saw mounting debt. In other words, um, when a government tries to pay its way out of a depression, help out, it actually just creates a greater debt. Um, and so there are some who argue there's more features to it, but I won't get into details. It's not super enthralling to listen to, but there are many historians who kind of debate whether Roosevelt's New Deal, and he's trying to spend his way out of this depression, actually extended the depression in the United States. By 1932, 1933 in Germany, in a lot of parts in Europe, the depression's kind of over, but it's not in the US. It lasts pretty much the end of the 1930s. And so some people, what causes that to happen, historical causation, is how much of that is due to Roosevelt's New Deal, that policy that he had. In Australia, we've got similar kind of impacts. And so industries like primary industries like agriculture, mining, wool production, they take a significant hit, which means that Australia's GDP, the gross domestic product, drops around 10% in 2 years. The unemployment in Australia is actually worse. It's up 30%. And by 30%, it's 30% who are unemployed. Most of the others who are still employed are on reduced hours. So You technically still have a job, but you're not working as much. Therefore, you're not earning as much. Um, Social consequences, obviously similar to America, where Australians had to um, move out of their a lot of them had to move out of their homes, rely on soup kitchens and charities, Christian charities, to try meet their basic needs. So this is once again this humiliating aspect of I can't provide for my family. Um, a lot of them have to, children have to give up going to school or get a really abbreviated basic schooling during this time. By 1932, 60,000 men, women, and children are dependent on the SUSO. This is the sustenance payment. And so this is a payment, um, maybe similar to the dole, that you could use to buy food, and buy food, the bare minimum of food. And so there's this, I found this poem about this. That's we're on the Susso now, we can't afford a cow. We live in a tent, we pay no rent, we're on the Susso now. So this idea of being, you know, sustenance, or being supported and supplied by the government just to keep yourself alive. It's no surprise that suicide rates increased dramatically during this time in Australia. One thing that they do during the 1930s is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So Sydney Harbour Bridge is a significant moment, and it is, it shouldn't be kind of, it's a bridge, who cares. It was a significant social moment just to give people hope that things are looking down, but here, look at what we've created here, look at what we've built. um, it had obviously practical um, application in that the north and south of Sydney are kind of keep together, but it gave people hope during this time period. And this is also where things like radios and particularly sports men and women, particularly men, become really important. So like Don Bradman becomes really important in the 1930s in Australia because he gives people hope. And so you talk, part of Don Bradman's legacy and why he is so popular is because of the time period he played in. He's a guy who was almost twice as good as the next best cricketer, and his greatest time period in for Australia was during these years where people would struggle to even pay for a ticket to go see him. And so the 90th, the depression in the 1930s, it's a big topic, obviously, but it's a time period where once again social values were questioned. So there's values in the 1920s that seen people change, um, what society should look like. They once again get really changed, pushed again. Sorry, my daughter just came in. A good resource on this, if you want a resource, just on this whole time period. Ian Kershaw is one of the best historians on Europe. He writes a massive biography on Hitler, but this one, To Hell and Back, Europe 1914 to 1949, very, very good book if you look at one about this time period. And there's my email if you've got any questions. Thanks.